You feed a lonely man long enough, he starts to wonder what else your hands are good for. And sometimes what he starts wondering has nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with something much, much older. This is the story of Calder Wade, a man who hadn't been touched by another soul in 10 years, a man who was rotting from the inside out. And this is the story of the woman who answered his call for a cook, thinking she was running from her own past. She had no idea she was running straight into his. The notice was pinned to the board at Murphy's Mercantile, handwritten on a scrap of paper torn from a ledger. The ink was faded, the handwriting shaky, like the man who wrote it was fighting a tremor in his own soul. It said, "Cook wanted. Good pay, no trouble." But it was that last part, "no trouble," that made everyone in Copper Ridge, Montana, give the note a wide berth. Because when you have to promise there'll be no trouble, it usually means there's nothing but. The man who'd pinned it there was Calder Wade. He was a giant of a man, stood 6'4" in his worn-out boots, with shoulders wide enough to block out the sun. But for all his size, he moved through the world like a ghost. For 10 years since the fever took his wife and daughter, Calder Wade had lived on canned beans and coffee that could strip paint. He spoke to no one. He looked at no one. The silence around him was so thick, so heavy, you could feel it pressing on your skin when he walked by. The women in town would cross the street to avoid him. The men would just give a slow, respectful nod from a distance, the kind you give to a walking tombstone. So when Elenina Hartwell stepped off the stagecoach, the town went quiet. She wasn't what anyone expected. 36 years old, a widow, with a grief she wore like a shield, not a shroud. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, and her eyes were the color of a stormy sea, and they missed nothing. She carried a single carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world. She walked straight into the mercantile, the floorboards groaning under her determined stride, and pointed a steady finger at the notice. "I'm here for the cooking position," she said, her voice clear and calm. Murphy, the store owner, a man whose face was a roadmap of other people's business, nearly dropped the sack of flour he was holding. His eyebrows shot up to a hairline that had retreated long ago. "Ma'am," he stammered, wiping his dusty hands on his apron. "You sure you want that one? That's for Calder Wade, out at the old ranch." "The notice says good pay and no trouble," Elenina replied, her chin held high. "I can provide the cooking. I expect him to provide the rest." Murphy just shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, some things, some troubles, they ain't the kind a man can control." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Folks say that ranch ain't right. Hasn't been right since the sickness." Elenina's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not afraid of ghosts, Mr. Murphy. I've seen what living men can do. It's far worse." The ride out to the Wade Ranch was 40 minutes of silence and dust. Murphy drove her in his rickety wagon, and the further they got from town, the more the land itself seemed to hold its breath. The rolling hills were dotted with cattle, thin and listless. The fences sagged, leaning like tired old men. A loneliness seeped up from the ground, from the cracked earth and the sun-bleached grass. A loneliness so profound it felt like a presence. Then the house came into view. It was a solid log structure, with a wide porch and big windows. But it looked abandoned. Not empty, but abandoned, like the people inside had just given up one day. Laundry, gray and stiff, hung crooked on a line. A stack of dirty dishes sat on the porch rail, buzzing with flies. The garden was a grave of withered stalks and triumphant weeds. As the wagon pulled up, the barn door creaked open, and Calder Wade emerged. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, a man who'd learned long ago not to waste a single motion. His hair was long and streaked with silver, his beard untrimmed, but it was his eyes that stopped Elenina's breath. They were the pale, flat blue of a winter sky right before a blizzard, and they were looking right through her. "You the cook?" His voice was a rasp, a gravelly sound from a throat long unused to forming words. "I am," she said, stepping down from the wagon before Murphy could help her. "Elenina Hartwell." He just stared at her. His gaze dropped to her worn but sturdy shoes, to the calluses on her hands, then back to her face. He was assessing her, weighing her, and for a terrifying second, she felt like he could see every mistake she'd ever made, every secret she was running from. House is rough, he said, the words clipped. Works hard. 25 a month. Room and board. It was a fortune. More than she'd seen in 2 years. When do I start? Now! Murphy unloaded her bag with the speed of a man fleeing a fire, gave her a look that was equal parts pity and terror, and was gone in a cloud of dust, leaving Elenina alone with the ghost of a man and the shell of a house. He led her inside without a word. The air in the house was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of dust, neglect, and something else. Something like old, settled grief. The parlor was shrouded in white sheets, a mausoleum of forgotten furniture. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms sat empty, coated in a fine layer of dust, their windows like vacant eyes. Room at the end of the hall is yours, Calder grunted, pointing. I'm by the stairs. He turned to leave, but Elenina's voice stopped him. Mr. Wade, what time do you take your meals? He paused, his back to her. For a long moment, she didn't think he'd answer. Don't matter, he said, his voice low. I eat when the hunger gets bad enough to ignore. And then he was gone, leaving her standing in the dusty hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on her from all sides. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of secrets, and got to work. She started with the kitchen. It was a battle. She scrubbed away years of grime, chasing mice from the pantry and spiders from the corners. As she worked, she felt a strange sensation, the distinct feeling of being watched. She'd turn, expecting to see Calder in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. Still, the feeling persisted. A cold spot in the air behind her left shoulder, a floorboard creaking in the empty room overhead. She told herself it was just an old house settling, but she knew deep down it was something else. That first night, she made fried chicken, biscuits, and gravy. The smell of real food, hot and savory, filled the house. A defiant act of life in a place that had long been surrendered to decay. She called Calder to the table. He came and sat, his huge frame looking awkward and out of place at his own kitchen table. He moved with the stiff caution of a man who'd forgotten how to be comfortable. They ate in silence. It was a loud silence, filled with the scrape of forks on plates and the hum of the ever-present loneliness. Elenina didn't push. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. She saw the way his eyes closed for a fraction of a second when he took the first bite. She saw the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. She saw the flicker of surprise on his face when he tasted her apple cobbler. He ate 3 helpings. For 3 days, this was their ritual. Shared meals in a cavernous silence. Polite, distant, 2 ships passing in a fog of unspoken sorrow. Elenina cleaned. She cooked. She started to chip away at the fortress of neglect that had overtaken the house. She washed the windows, letting sunlight pierce the gloom for the first time in years. She beat the dust from the rugs. She even tackled the weed-choked garden. And all the while she felt him watching. Not in a threatening way, in a curious way, a hungry way. On the 3rd night after a supper of beef stew that had him quietly clearing his plate, he finally spoke. Elenina was clearing the dishes, her back to him, when his voice cut through the silence, sharp as a shard of glass. I haven't had a woman in 10 years. The words were raw, unfiltered. Not a proposition, but a statement of fact. A confession. Elenina froze, the heavy platter cold in her hands. She could feel his eyes on her back. He wasn't finished. Ate the food, he said, his voice rougher now, like he was dragging the words up from somewhere deep and rusted. He was staring at his empty plate, his knuckles white where he gripped his coffee cup. Now I crave the cook. The air crackled. The quiet of the kitchen became a roaring in her ears. A blush, hot and unwelcome, crept up her neck. It was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else. A faint, forgotten flicker of warmth she hadn't felt since long before her husband died. She turned slowly to face him. His pale eyes were locked on her, and for the first time, she saw something in them besides emptiness. She saw a desperate, aching hunger that had nothing to do with food. Mr. Wade, she began, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. I was hired to cook and to keep this house. That is all. He gave a single sharp nod. His gaze dropped back to his cup. Understood. he said. The word clipped. Just, needed to say it. But it was too late. The words were out. They hung in the air between them, a dangerous spark in a house full of dry tinder. And they changed everything. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged. The space between them was no longer a gulf. It was a tightly stretched wire. Elenina found herself hyper-aware of him, the way the muscles in his forearms bunched when he chopped wood, the rare, low rumble of his laugh when the dog did something stupid, the way he always kept a careful, deliberate distance between them, a distance that now felt like a physical effort. A fragile truce was established, an unspoken agreement to pretend he hadn't said what he said and she hadn't felt what she felt. But pretending doesn't make a thing untrue. It just gives it time to grow in the dark. 3 weeks into this delicate dance, Elenina found the photograph. She was finally tackling the parlor, pulling the dusty sheets off the furniture. On the mantel, behind a heavy brass candlestick, was a silver frame, placed face down, as if someone had wanted to hide it but couldn't bring themselves to throw it away. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it over. The image was of a younger Calder. His face was softer, unlined by grief. His arm was wrapped around a small, dark-haired woman with a smile that could have lit up the whole county. And sitting on his broad shoulders was a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, with her father's pale blue eyes and her mother's bright smile. They looked happy, so impossibly, painfully happy. This was the family, the wife, Sarah, the daughter, Annie, the ghosts that haunted every corner of this silent house. This was what he had lost. "You shouldn't be looking at that." The voice came from the doorway, cold and hard as iron. Elenina spun around, clutching the frame to her chest like a thief. Calder stood there, his face a thundercloud, his eyes stripped bare of everything but pain. The brief, fragile connection they had built over the past few weeks shattered into 1,000 pieces. I was just dusting," she stammered, her voice small. "I didn't mean to pry." He didn't move. He just stood there, his huge frame filling the doorway, blocking the light. "Put it back. Mr. Wade, Put it back," he repeated, and this time his voice was flat, dead. The voice of a man who had gone somewhere far away, somewhere she couldn't follow. She carefully placed the photograph back on the mantel, face down, just as she had found it. The silence in the room was suffocating. She expected him to leave, to retreat back into his fortress of solitude. Instead, he walked slowly into the room, stopping beside the fireplace. He didn't look at the photo. He looked into the empty, ash-filled hearth. "Her name was Sarah," he said, the words sounding like they were being torn out of him. "The little one was Annie." The past tense was a punch to the gut. "What happened to them?" Elenina asked softly, though she already knew the town's version of the story. Calder's jaw worked for a moment. "Fever," he said, the word brittle. "Winter of '84. Took 'em both, in 3 days." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were hollowed out, haunted. "I was in Denver, selling cattle. Gone 2 weeks." His voice cracked. "Came home to 2 fresh graves behind the barn and a house full of their things." Elenina's heart ached for him, for the unimaginable horror of that homecoming. "I am so sorry, Calder." He shook his head, a violent, angry motion. "Shouldn't have gone. Sarah, she begged me not to. Said Annie was feeling poorly, but the money was good. I told her she was worrying for nothing." He let out a harsh, broken sound that might have been a laugh. "Been paying for it ever since." That's when she saw it. Over his shoulder in the grimy parlor window, she saw a reflection. It wasn't hers. It wasn't his. For just a split second, she saw the faint, shimmering outline of a small girl, standing in the yard looking in at them. Elenina blinked, and it was gone. It was just a trick of the light, the old warped glass playing games with her eyes. It had to be. But her blood ran cold. The feeling of being watched, the cold spots, the creaking floors. Murphy's words came back to her. "Folks say that ranch ain't right." She thought the ghosts were just memories. What if they were more than that? That night something shifted between them. His confession, raw and painful, had knocked a brick out of the wall he'd built around himself. And Elenina, seeing that crack, felt compelled to offer a piece of her own brokenness in return. Over coffee, she told him about her husband, Thomas, how his charm had hidden a weakness for cards and bad investments, how he'd lost money that wasn't his to lose. When he died, she said, her voice quiet, the men he owed came to collect. They didn't lay a hand on me. They were smarter than that. They just took everything. The house, the furniture, my wedding ring. They turned the whole town against me, made it seem like his debts were my sins. Calder listened, his pale eyes never leaving her face. When she was finished, he said, his voice a low rumble, folks are cruelest when they're scared. It wasn't absolution, but it was understanding. Two people branded and cast out by their pasts, sitting together in a quiet kitchen, finding a strange comfort in their shared damage. In the days that followed, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Calder started talking more. Not much, just a comment about the weather, a question about what she was cooking. He even fixed the broken step on the porch she'd been meaning to ask him about. He started lingering after meals, and the silences between them became less of a void and more of a comfortable quiet. Elenina found herself watching him, not with fear or pity, but with a growing, dangerous affection. She saw the gentleness in his massive hands when he treated a sick calf. She saw the intelligence in his eyes when he spoke about the land. She was beginning to see the man who had existed before the grief, and she was beginning to fall for him. The night the storm hit, it felt like the sky was trying to tear the world apart. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind shrieked around the corners of the house like a banshee. Elenina was in the parlor, trying to read by the firelight, when Calder appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. Figured you might want some company, he said a little awkwardly. Storms like this can be unsettling. He was right. The house groaned and shuddered under the assault of the wind, and with every flash of lightning, the windows looked like empty, screaming mouths. They sat by the fire talking for hours. They talked about their childhoods, about books, about dreams they'd long since buried. It was easy, natural. For the first time, they weren't just a boss and his cook. They were 2 people. As the storm raged on and the night wore on, Elenina's eyes grew heavy. You should get some rest, Calder said gently. Stairs might be treacherous in the dark if the power goes. You can take the sofa. I'll take the other end. Just till the storm passes. It was practical, sensible, and yet her heart fluttered. She curled up on one end of the long sofa, pulling an Afghan over her. Calder stretched out on the other, both of them fully clothed, a careful 3 feet of space between them. The sound of the rain and the warmth of the fire were a hypnotic lullaby, and soon they were both asleep. Elenina woke up to a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was a wet, desperate, choking gasp, a sound of pure, primal terror. Her eyes snapped open. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. She sat bolt upright, her heart slamming against her ribs. The sound was coming from Calder, but what she saw made no sense. He was rigid, his entire body arched impossibly, his back bent like a bow. But he wasn't on the sofa. He was floating. He was suspended a good 6 inches above the cushions, his muscles locked, his body trembling with a violent, unseen force. His eyes were rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and the horrifying, liquid choking sounds were ripping from his throat. He was unconscious, trapped in a nightmare made real, and the air in the room had dropped 20 degrees. It was ice cold, a dead, predatory cold that sucked the breath from her lungs. Calder! She screamed, scrambling toward him. Calder, wake up! She reached for his shoulder to shake him, to break him free from whatever had its claws in him, but her hand passed right through him. She gasped, pulling her hand back as if burned. There was nothing there, just empty, freezing air where his solid, muscular shoulder should have been. It was like he was a projection, a hologram of agony. Panic, raw and shrieking, clawed at her throat. This wasn't a nightmare. This was an attack. Something was in the room with them. Something cold and ancient and full of hate. Come back, she shrieked, her voice breaking with terror. Whatever you are, let him go. Come back to me. Without thinking, driven by a desperate primal instinct, she drew her hand back and slapped the empty space where his face was hovering. The sound was like a gunshot. A loud, wet crack echoed through the silent house as her palm connected with something impossibly solid. Calder dropped. He crashed down onto the sofa cushions like a sack of stones, his body convulsing. He took a huge, ragged gasp of air, his lungs fighting for oxygen. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, staring at the ceiling. For a terrifying moment, he didn't seem to know where he was, or who she was. Then his gaze found hers and she saw confusion, terror, and a sliver of profound gratitude. "Elenina," he rasped, his voice wrecked. "I'm here," she said, her own voice trembling. She hovered over him, wanting to touch him, to reassure him, but afraid of what she might find. "You're safe. You're back." He struggled to sit up, running a shaky hand through his hair. What did you see?" She told him everything. The levitation, the choking, the fact that she couldn't touch him. She watched his face grow pale, his expression shifting from confusion to a deep, familiar horror. He knew what this was. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "It's been happening," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, "since they died. Not always like that. Sometimes it's just the choking. Sometimes I feel like I'm being pulled out of my own skin, pulled somewhere else, somewhere dark." "Have you seen a doctor?" she asked, though she knew what the answer would be. He gave a bitter, humorless laugh. "Doc Peterson says it's nightmares. Guilt. Says I'm punishing myself in my sleep." He looked at her, and the terror in his eyes was stark and real. "It doesn't feel like dreams, Elenina. It feels like something is trying to drag me away. It feels like something wants me gone." Ice crept through her veins. She'd heard old stories from her grandmother, whispers of grief so powerful it could tear a hole between the worlds. A calling, she'd named it. When the dead get so lonely, they try to pull the living across with them. Was it Sarah and Annie? Were their spirits so lost, so heartbroken, that they were trying to drag Calder into the grave to be with them? The thought was both tragic and utterly terrifying. The next morning, the fragile intimacy they had built was gone, replaced by a thick wall of fear and shame. Calder was distant, his eyes shadowed. He ate his breakfast in silence, avoiding her gaze, and then disappeared to work on the furthest corner of the ranch, a tiny figure against the vast, empty landscape. He was running, trying to put distance between himself and what had happened, between himself and her, the witness to his horrifying secret. When he came in for dinner, mud-splattered and exhausted, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. "Mr. Wade," Elenina started, needing to talk about it, to understand it. He cut her off with a sharp shake of his head. His face was a closed door. "Best we don't talk about it," he said, his voice flat. "Best we just forget it happened." But Elenina couldn't forget. You don't forget watching a man levitate while something invisible tries to strangle him. You don't forget the feeling of your hand passing through a human being. Whatever was haunting Calder Wade, it wasn't just guilt. It was real. It was hungry. And she had a terrible feeling it was just getting started. 3 days later, trouble rode up to their door on horseback. Elenina was kneading bread dough when she heard the horses. 3 of them. She peered through the kitchen window and her stomach clenched. She recognized one of the men instantly. Preston Cartwright. He was a man who looked soft, but was hard as nails underneath. He owned the bank, the saloon, and half the businesses in Copper Ridge. And his greatest ambition was to own the other half. He was known for his polite smile and his ruthless methods of collecting debts and properties. The other 2 men were new, hard-faced men with guns on their hips who looked like they were comfortable with violence. Calder emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Elenina watched from the window as the confrontation unfolded. She couldn't hear the words, but the body language was clear. Cartwright was all smooth gestures and false smiles. Calder was a stone wall. One of Cartwright's men kept glancing toward the house, towards her window, and his sneer was unmistakable. They knew she was here, and they thought it mattered. When they finally rode off, Calder's face was like a thunderhead. He stalked into the kitchen, the screen door slamming behind him, and poured a cup of coffee with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. What did he want? Elenina asked, her hands frozen in the dough. Same thing he always wants, Calder bit out, his voice tight with rage. My land. He took a scalding sip of coffee. Claims I'm behind on a bank loan. Says if I can't pay up, he's willing to make a generous offer to take this place off my hands. Elenina frowned. Do you owe the bank money? Not a damn cent. I paid that loan off 2 years ago, but my copy of the receipt was lost in a fire at the county records office last year. A fire I'm now pretty sure Cartwright started himself. He's got the banker in his pocket. It's my word against theirs. He stared into his cup, then looked up at her, and his eyes were filled with a weary dread. That's not all. He had some questions about my new domestic arrangement. The blood drained from Elenina's face. What kind of questions? The kind that can ruin a woman's reputation in a town this size. The kind that make it pretty damn clear he knows about the storm. He knows you were on that sofa with me. A cold fog settled over her. How? How could he possibly know that? Calder's expression darkened. Cartwright has eyes and ears everywhere. Could be Murphy. Could be one of the hands I had to let go last season. It doesn't matter how he knows. What matters is that he's going to use it. He'll paint you as a whore and me as a sinner. He'll turn the whole town against us, make it impossible for me to stay. The trap was closing in. For her, it meant being run out of town with a ruined name, unable to find work anywhere. For Calder, it was the final nail in his coffin, the leverage Cartwright needed to steal the land his family had worked for generations. What are we going to do? She whispered. Calder was silent for a long, agonizing moment. He stared out the window at the land, at the hills and the sky, at the only thing he had left in the world. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of all emotion. You're going to pack your things, he said. I'll put you on tomorrow's stagecoach. It felt like a slap, a cold, calculated dismissal. You're sending me away? I'm protecting you, he said, his voice flat, his eyes refusing to meet hers. And myself. Cartwright can't use what doesn't exist. You leave. The gossip dies. I'll deal with Cartwright on my own. After everything, she began, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. What we've shared is meals and a roof, he cut in, his voice harsh. Nothing more. It was a lie, a brutal, necessary lie. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped. The bond between them was real, it was powerful, and it terrified him even more than Cartwright did. He wasn't just pushing her away to protect her from gossip. He was pushing her away to protect her from the darkness that clung to him, the thing that choked him in his sleep. She wanted to fight, to argue, to tell him that running was not the answer. But she saw the finality in his eyes. He had made up his mind. He was retreating back into his fortress, and this time he was locking the gate behind him. That evening she packed her small carpet bag. Each folded dress, each worn book felt like a stone being laid on her heart. She was placing her mother's old Bible inside when she heard it again, the choking. It was coming from his bedroom, at the top of the stairs. The sound froze her blood. It was worse than before, more desperate, more violent. She could hear thrashing, the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Her first instinct was to run, to help him. But she stopped, her hand on the newel post. If she went into his bedroom, she would be proving Cartwright right. She would be giving him the weapon he needed to destroy them both. She pressed her ear to his closed door. The choking was frantic, punctuated by terrible, strangled gasps. He was dying. Right now, a few feet away from her. Her choice was simple, her reputation or his life. It wasn't a choice at all. Just as her hand touched the cool brass doorknob, the sound stopped, abruptly. The silence that followed was 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise. It was the absolute profound silence of a held breath, of a stopped heart. She eased the door open. Calder was on the floor beside his bed, lying on his back. His face was as pale as wax in the moonlight, streaming through the window. His lips were blue, and his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, but they were empty, utterly, terrifyingly vacant. He wasn't there. He was gone. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling. She pressed her ear to his chest. Faintly, so faintly she could barely hear it, his heart was still beating, a frantic, irregular flutter, like a trapped bird. But he wasn't breathing, and then she saw the marks. Around his throat, dark, angry red bruises were forming, bruises in the distinct shape of fingers, as if a pair of large, invisible hands had been, and still were, squeezing the life out of him. This time, her slap did nothing. Shaking him did nothing. He was locked in, a prisoner in his own body, while something from the other side slowly, methodically killed him. She was alone, in a dark house, in the middle of nowhere, with a dying man and the monster that was murdering him. Elena refused to let him go. She spent the entire night on the floor of his bedroom, a vigil of one. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. She watched the terrifying stillness of his body, the faint flickering pulse at his bruised throat, and she talked. She didn't know what else to do. She talked about anything and everything. She told him about her childhood, about the smell of rain on the dust in Ohio. She told him about a stray dog she'd once nursed back to health. She told him about her dreams, the ones she'd had before life had taught her it was safer not to have any. She filled the terrifying silence with the sound of her voice, a lifeline thrown into the darkness where he was lost. "You can't let it win, Calder," she whispered, her voice growing hoarse as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window. "You have to fight. I know you're tired, but you have to fight your way back. Come back to me." Just as the sun crested the hills, his eyes blinked. They fluttered, then focused. On her. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary confusion. And something else. Relief. A relief so profound it was like watching a drowning man take his first breath. "You stayed," he rasped, his throat raw. "Of course I stayed," she said, tears welling in her eyes. He struggled to sit up, and she helped him, her arm around his broad back. He leaned against her, his weight solid and real, and for a moment they just stayed like that, sitting on the floor as the sun filled the room. The impropriety of it, the danger, none of it mattered. "It was different this time," he said, his voice a ghost of its usual rumble. "Stronger. I could feel it, pulling me. I could see them, Elenina, Sarah and Annie. They were standing on the other side of a river. They were calling to me, telling me to come with them, that it wouldn't hurt anymore." Elenina's throat tightened. "But you didn't go." He looked at her, and his pale eyes were filled with a kind of wonder she'd never seen before. "I couldn't. I heard your voice. It was like a rope, pulling me back. Every time I took a step toward them, I'd hear you, and it would pull me back." He reached out, and his large, calloused hand covered hers. It was the first time he had willingly touched her. His skin was warm. "How did you know? How did you know to keep talking?" "I didn't know anything," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I was just so scared of losing you." The admission hung in the air between them, simple and true, and it broke the last of the walls. "Elenina," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of a decade of secrets. "I have to tell you something about the night they died, the real reason I was gone." She waited, her heart pounding. She sensed that this was the key, the source of the darkness. "I wasn't just in Denver selling cattle," he said, his gaze dropping to the floorboards. "I was meeting another woman, someone from town. She made me feel, I don't know, young, reckless, made me forget for a little while how tired I was." His voice cracked. Sarah knew. She didn't say it, but I saw it in her eyes. That's why she begged me not to go. It wasn't just because Annie had a sniffle. It was because she knew where I was going, who I was going to. And I looked my wife in the eye, and I lied to her, and I went anyway. The confession landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. It was a betrayal so much deeper, so much colder than simple absence. "The fever might have taken them anyway, Calder," Elenina said softly. "You can't blame yourself for that." "Can I?" He looked up, and his face was a mask of self-loathing. Tears tracked paths through the dust on his weathered cheeks. "I chose another woman over my family. I left them alone when they needed me most. My wife died thinking I didn't love her. And the worst part is, his voice broke completely. Maybe she was right. Maybe in that moment I didn't. And maybe that's why they can't rest. Maybe that's why they keep calling me home. To punish me. And then Elenina understood. It wasn't just grief that was haunting him. It was guilt. A monstrous, cancerous guilt so powerful it had taken on a life of its own. It had become a separate entity. A thing of teeth and claws that was feeding on his soul, using the memory of his wife and daughter as a weapon against him. "You want to know what I think?" she said, her voice suddenly fierce. She took his hands in both of hers, forcing him to look at her. "I think you are being haunted," Calder, "but not by Sarah and Annie. I think their spirits are at peace. You are being haunted by your own shame. It's gotten so strong, so powerful, that it's trying to kill you, to drag you down into the dark where it lives." She leaned closer, her eyes locked on his. "Your wife and daughter don't want you dead. They would want you to forgive yourself. They would want you to stop punishing yourself and start living again." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. She didn't know if he believed her. She wasn't even sure if she believed herself. But she knew one thing. She wasn't leaving him alone to face it. That night she brought her own blankets and pillows from her room and made a bed for herself on the floor next to his. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief. "I'm not letting you face the dark alone," she said simply. He opened his mouth to argue, to tell her about propriety, about Cartwright, about the danger, but she silenced him. She stood up, leaned over, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of promise, of solidarity, a declaration of war against the shadows. When she pulled away, his eyes were wide, stunned. "I'm staying," she whispered. "Here, with you. Whatever comes, we face it together." And for the first time in 10 years, Calder Wade did not sleep alone. He did not choke. He did not feel the cold pull of the other side. He slept. And in the dark, silent house, something else slept too. The hungry thing, denied its meal of guilt and fear, retreated into the corners and waited. For 3 days, a fragile peace settled over the ranch. Calder and Elenina moved in a new orbit, a shared gravity pulling them closer. They talked. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending the garden, breathing life back into the dying ranch. The house, which had once felt like a tomb, began to fill with the sounds of quiet laughter and easy conversation. The love that grew between them was not the frantic, desperate passion of youth. It was something quieter, stronger. The tenacious, hard-won love of two broken people who had found in each other the missing pieces to make themselves whole. But they both knew it was a temporary truce. The darkness was still there, lurking in the shadows. And so was Preston Cartwright. He arrived on the 4th day, not with his hired thugs, but with the town sheriff. They rode up just as Calder was repairing the porch steps and Elenina was hanging laundry. Cartwright dismounted, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He was holding a piece of paper. "Wade," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sheriff, here has an eviction notice for you. The bank has foreclosed on this property due to non-payment of your loan." "I told you that loan is paid," Calder said, his voice a low growl as he rose to his full, intimidating height. "A claim you have no proof of," Cartwright said smoothly. "It's a sad thing, but the law's the law." He then turned his venomous smile on Elenina. "And speaking of the law, Sheriff, I'd also like to file a formal complaint for lewd and lascivious behavior. This woman has been living here, in this man's house, unchaperoned. It's a disgrace to this community." The sheriff, a portly man with a nervous twitch, shuffled his feet and refused to meet Calder's eyes. He was clearly in Cartwright's pocket. This was it, the final move. Cartwright was taking everything. The land, their names, their future. But Cartwright had made a critical mistake. He thought he was dealing with the same broken, haunted man he had been tormenting for years. He wasn't. Calder looked at Elenina. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he didn't see fear. He saw strength. He saw trust. He saw a reason to fight. He turned back to Cartwright, and for the first time in a decade, A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a terrifying sight. "You know what, Cartwright?" he said, his voice calm. "I don't care. I don't care what you or this whole town says about us. I don't care if you think it's improper. I spent 10 years of my life as a ghost, dead inside. This woman," he said, gesturing to Elenina, "brought me back to life. So you can take your papers, and your gossip, and your bought and paid for sheriff, and you can get the hell off my land." Cartwright's smile faltered. "You're throwing your life away, Wade. You'll have nothing." "I already have everything that matters," Calder said, taking Elenina's hand. Enraged, Cartwright lunged for him. "This is my property now." And that's when it happened. As Cartwright's hand reached for Calder, the air temperature plummeted. A sudden, unnatural wind kicked up, swirling dust and leaves around them. The sky, clear moments before, turned a bruised, sickly gray. A shadow fell over the porch, a shadow with no source, a patch of darkness so deep it seemed to absorb the light. The horses screamed, rearing in terror. The sheriff stumbled back, his face white with fear. From the open doorway of the house, a low growl emanated. It wasn't an animal sound. It was the sound of grinding stones, of ancient hatred given voice. The entity, the thing that fed on Calder's guilt, had been dormant. But this new intrusion, this new source of fear and rage, had woken it up, and it was hungry. Cartwright froze, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the dark doorway. What in God's name is that?" "That," Calder said, his voice steady as he pulled Elenina behind him, "is my ghost, and he doesn't like visitors." The shadow in the doorway seemed to coalesce, to darken. 2 points of malevolent red light, like hot coals, ignited within it. It was the thing from Calder's nightmares, the thing that had tried to choke the life from him. But now its attention wasn't on him. It was on Cartwright. It had found a new target, a soul dripping with greed, cruelty, and fear. A feast. With a shriek that tore at the senses, the shadow thing surged forward. It didn't move like a living creature. It flowed across the porch like spilled ink, a wave of pure negative energy. Cartwright screamed, a high, thin sound of utter terror, as the darkness enveloped him. He was lifted off his feet, his body thrashing, his hands clawing at his own throat as invisible fingers closed around it. He was being choked, just like Calder had been. The sheriff, snapping out of his fear-induced paralysis, drew his gun. He fired 3 shots into the swirling mass of darkness. The bullets passed through it without effect. The shadow thing just laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "Calder, do something!" Elenina cried, clutching his arm. Calder looked at the writhing, screaming form of his enemy, and then he looked at the dark thing that was killing him. He knew in that moment what he had to do. This monster was born of his guilt. It was tied to him, and only he could unmake it. He stepped forward, placing himself between the entity and its prey. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. The shadow thing paused, its red eyes fixing on him. Cartwright dropped to the porch, gasping and sputtering. "You have no power here anymore," Calder said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm not your prisoner. I am not guilty. I made a mistake, a terrible one, and I will live with it for the rest of my days, but I will not die for it. I choose to live. I choose her." He pointed to Elenina. "My past is my past, but she is my future." He then turned to the memory that the thing had used against him for so long. He spoke to the open air, to the spirits he now knew were truly at peace. "Sarah, Annie, I'm sorry. I will never stop being sorry. But I have to let you go. I have to live. I hope you can forgive me." As he spoke the words, a brilliant shaft of sunlight broke through the unnatural gray clouds, illuminating him. The shadow thing shrieked as the light hit it, recoiling as if struck. It was losing its anchor. The guilt it fed on was being replaced by forgiveness. The darkness was being burned away by light. With one last agonized howl that echoed across the valley, the shadow entity dissolved. It didn't fly away. It just came apart, like smoke in the wind. vanishing into nothingness. The oppressive cold vanished. The sky cleared. The only sounds were Cartwright's pathetic whimpering and the birds tentatively starting to sing again. The sheriff stared, his mouth agape, his gun hanging limply in his hand. He looked at Calder, then at the sniveling Cartwright, and made a swift decision. He holstered his pistol, walked over, and hauled Cartwright to his feet. I think there's been a mistake at the bank, the sheriff stammered, his eyes wide with awe and terror. I'll be looking into it, personally. He dragged the disgraced, trembling man to his horse and rode away as fast as he could, not looking back once. Calder and Elenina were left alone on the porch in the sudden, peaceful silence. He turned to her, his face streaked with tears and dust. He looked free. The haunted, hollowed-out look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a clear, steady light. "It's over," he whispered. "It's over," she confirmed, her own tears falling freely. He pulled her into his arms, and this time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. He held her like a man who had been drowning and had finally found the shore. You feed a lonely man long enough, he might just remember how to be human again. But you give a haunted man a reason to live, and he'll fight off the demons of hell itself for you. Calder Wade had been a dead man walking for 10 years. Elenina Hartwell had been running from her past for 2. But together, on that sun-drenched porch, they finally found their way home. They learned that the best way to honor the dead isn't to join them in the grave, but to live a life so full of love and light that it illuminates even the darkest of memories. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to fight your demons, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And in the comments, let me know. Have you ever had a feeling in an old house that you just couldn't explain? I read every single one. Thanks for watching.